introduce with a few pertinent remarks, Ralph Coluntino.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning,
Welcome. Thank you for coming. We gather today to remember our fallen on this, the 150th anniversary of the first Decoration Day. It is also the 99th year of operation for the Michael J. Cadigan Post 46 of Beverly Farms, so I'd like to offer a short congratulations to them too. The people of this city have spent over 100 years coming together and remembering in this parade. I've personally been privileged enough to take part in this parade in some form for the last 14 years, and I hope to be able to continue to do so in the future. In that time, I've spoke about the World Wars, the Civil War, Vietnam, and the War on Terror. But I've never talked about a conflict very seldom mentioned in American history, Korea. To learn more about the Korean War, however, we have to dive back more than 100 years. After nearly 2 centuries of peace, an intimidating and powerful Japanese empire made the Korean emperor sign a letter of mark of protection in 1905. Then, 5 years later, signing a second letter giving their sovereignty over to Japan. This annexation of Korea is viewed today by most Korean scholars as coerced, that they were forced to sign rather than fight the Japanese. Japan ruled Korea harshly. In 1919, after the death of their emperor, rallies were held throughout Korea to protest the Japanese and their atrocities. These rallies resulted in over 7,000 Korean civilians killed by the Japanese army. A provincial government in exile, known as the Republic of Korea, began organizing resistance from Shanghai. But although their efforts for independence lasted for many years, they had very little success against the powerful and disciplined Japanese army. In 1945, all of this changed for Korea with the dropping of the atomic bombs. The Soviet Union had declared war against Japan and began moving forces toward Manchuria in China, a precursor for the invasion of Korea, which still held several thousand Japanese troops. This movement panicked the American leadership, who, despite being at war and in alliance with the Soviet Union, wanted to contain the communist power. With no real way to get forces into Korea in time, the US and Soviet Union signed a pact to divide the country into 2 zones of occupation along the 38th parallel. This was to be a temporary assignment, as both powers agreed to sit down a few months later and hammer out a final reunification agreement. But this was not to be the case. As negotiations as to how to reunify Korea dragged on and began to break down, the political situation in Korea became very desperate. The split between North and South attracted communists and capitalists to move to their preferred side of the parallel. At the same time, an avowed anti-communist and the first president of the provincial government in exile, Syngman Rhee, returned to Korea and quickly became the most prominent politician in the South. While before the Japanese occupation, the Koreans had neither leaned capitalist nor communist, the country very quickly became stratified between these systems. As negotiations stretched on for years, the United Nations finally acted on the matter. The UN called on the USSR and the USA to remove their forces from the peninsula and to allow a UN-supervised election to take place. The United States agreed to the agreement, but the Russians boycotted the resolution and the election. Elections in the South took place under UN supervision, where Syngman Rhee won by an overwhelming landslide. A few months after he took power, the United States formally handed over power to the Republic of Korea and formally recognized his government. The Soviet Union, not to be outdone, instituted Kim Il-sung as the Prime Minister of the People's Democratic Republic of Korea in the north. Both governments claimed all of Korea as theirs. The situation in Korea very quickly spiraled out of control. With both the Soviet Union and the United States distracted by the situation in Europe, and especially Berlin, border conflicts broke out all along the 38th parallel. In 1950, the North officially invaded the South. The South Koreans fought bravely, but they were outnumbered nearly 2-1. In response, the United Nations resolved to allow the United States to lead a coalition of nations into Korea to restore the 38th parallel. The legendary Douglas MacArthur was given command of the operation. He landed at Incheon, behind the North Korean lines, and quickly broke the back of the enemy. U.S. naval and air power overwhelmed the North Korean forces, and MacArthur's forces very quickly reached the 38th parallel, where the Army of the Republic of Korea in the south charged over the parallel to reunify the country. After some negotiation, the UN and United States reluctantly allowed MacArthur to cross the parallel as well, trying to find a speedy end to the war. President Truman was very clear with MacArthur about one point, however. He was to in no way upset the Chinese. If the Chinese mobilized or threatened action against the United States, he was to stop his advance, and under no circumstance whatsoever was he to cross into China. General MacArthur had made public comments and advocated for a drive into China once he reached the North Korean-Chinese border in order to attack depots which he believed were arming the North Koreans. For this, he was later fired. The Soviet Union stayed out of this war. They were preoccupied with Europe. But the other communist power in the region did not. The Chinese forces saw a threat with the invaders, especially given how quickly they were taking over northern land and very quickly approaching the Chinese border. Chinese-U.S. relations were also at a breaking point over the issue of Taiwan and the U.S. naval defensive blockade that was defending the island. Chinese leader Mao Zedong at first sent 200,000 Chinese soldiers into the Korean peninsula to turn the tide of the war. They were aided by Soviet-built MiG fighters, which challenged the U.S. for air superiority. The war was bloody and dragged on for several years, with both sides gaining and losing ground, while neither had a true advantage. By late 1951, the front had stabilized close to the 38th parallel, but the fighting was fierce and casualties were mounting. Neither side could commit more to the peninsula without weakening themselves on the international stage, so the war devolved into field by field, house by house, hill by hill, sometimes hand-to-hand combat for months without end. Negotiations about a peace agreement dragged on for many months, eventually failing altogether. But the armistice that they created held. The peace was uneasy and has been very tense in recent years. Today, we are left with a country that has never before been divided, now divided more starkly than any in history. In the north, a failed state with a tyrannical dictator sits atop a thriving modern democracy in South Korea. The South Koreans today enjoy the benefits of freedom like their counterparts in the north could only dream of. Their free, democratic society is an example to everyone in the region about what life could be. But freedom, as always, comes with a terrible price. This Memorial Day, I ask that we remember the incredible cost that has been borne onto us in order to maintain the freedom of this nation. I ask that we remember that of the men we sent into Korea, 36,574 would give their lives. In total, we suffered nearly 150,000 casualties. In particular, I ask that we remember two men from Beverly who would not be returning home, Roger Wallace and Joseph Vittori. Mr. Vittori, for a courageous defense that held the line against an enemy force while wounded, and for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his own life above and beyond the call of duty, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Freedom is always necessary to fight for, but the price of that freedom is incredibly high. More than a dozen attempts have been made to rectify the situation in Korea with a permanent peace agreement, all failing. Recently, as I'm sure everyone here knows, the Trump administration has pushed for a summit to denuclearize the North. We can only hope and pray that our diplomatic efforts create a long-lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. Those servicemen who have died in the Korean War will never be forgotten. neither by the war's living veterans or by all of us here today. Our gratitude to them can never be expressed in words, only by the thoughts and prayers offered in our hearts. And so we gather again, as we have done so many times and will continue to do forever, to remember those who have given their lives for this nation. To those who have paid this price, you have given us a debt that we can never repay. You have gone before us in the hope that we may wake up each morning as members of a free country, the greatest nation on earth. We pledge to you that we will do everything in our power to carry that torch forward, to make sure that the fire of freedom never goes out. We will stand together as Americans every hour of every day. Though our differences may set us apart, we must never let them divide us. For despite anything that keeps us separate, we have one thing in common: a responsibility, a duty to honor those who have given their lives so that we might be free. Thank you. May God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Well, thank you. That was magnificent.